Huge shout out to my fine patrons and tool partners. Now you guys have seen a video that I did on a pocket screw jig cabinet back in the day, but it was kind of small and I ran out of space fairly quickly. And I just recently acquired the new Armor Tool auto adjusting pocket screw jig, and it's got a few more bells and whistles that I want to show off. Get ready for Pocket Screw Cabinet 2.0. If this is your first time here, I want to take the time to welcome you. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and click that notification bell. You can also check out my Amazon and Patreon to help support the show even further. I post videos every Saturday. I intermingle project build videos and SketchUp tutorials to help you along the way to build things just like this. So now you've seen the finished product, let me take you through how we got it done. So I'm first going to start out with the 3/4 inch plywood. And what I like to do before cutting anything to final dimension is do a rough overcut, which means I'm just going to oversize this about 1 inch, maybe a 1/2 inch if you want to save some plywood, but it removes the rough edges or damaged edges that you might get from the store. So just overcut about 1 inch and then cut to your final width, and that way the clean edge of the next cut will be ready for final dimension. Now I'm going to start cutting these strips to some final dimensions, and just like before, square up one end and then cut it to final dimension after you do that. That way every cut thereafter will be nice and square. No rough edges. Now if your shop is too small or you just simply have something over here that's in your way, just overcut it by about 1/4 inch, then adjust your fence and then recut it to the final dimension. And then that way this cut right here for this side will be nice and square, and you won't have to bring it all the way over here and possibly hit something on the left side of your saw. Now I'll explain what these parts are as I have them all cut, but following my plan is really easy to do. If you want to download this for yourself, you can find it in my store or link below. Now the dovetail way is very, very crucial to make sure that this thing works properly for that pullout. Now I'm going to achieve the 45 cut with this 45-degree miter sled, which basically just rides in the miter slot of the right side of my blade. Now we couldn't make this cabinet without having some pocket screws here and there. And the cool thing about this jig is that it's auto adjusting. So whatever size that you have, this jig will automatically size to it just by pulling on one lever and then locking it down, okay? So the auto part also comes into play on the drill bit itself. So you know that you have a depth stop collar that on other jigs you have to manually set. Not on this one. As long as the collar is loose, all you have to do is put it inside with the collar inside this little groove of the jig itself. And then when you go to push it in place, the collar automatically slides up and down on the drill bit, causing it to be just the right depth for the piece of wood that you are going to use. So we'll just slide this open, put our piece of wood in, slide it in place, and then clamp it down. Now, all you gotta do is take the Allen wrench and tighten this collar up, take the bit out, put it in your drill, and it's ready to go. Now, another cool part about the jig is they color code all of their screws. So whenever you get the jig, you'll find that there are several different size screws, but they are color coded in such a way that correspond to what's on this jig. So whenever you get to this point, all you have to look is the height of the jig, and it tells you that this is a 3/4 inch thick piece, which coincides with the yellow screws. Now the piece that I have in this jig are the two left and right outer parts of the cabinet. Now there's going to be a 3/4 inch wide groove that's going to be run down the length of this, right down the middle, and it will house the divider between the upper and lower drawers. There are going to be some pocket screws in one edge, which is the upper edge, which I'm going to screw the top of the cabinet to. I won't be able to put pocket screws in the bottom because once this cabinet divider is in place, I won't be able to get to them, especially with the top being on. What I do plan on doing is cutting a small little notch in this divider, so whenever I go to put it on the top, I can run my drill bit through that hole into the pocket screw. You don't necessarily have to do pocket screws in this case, but that's completely up to you. All right, so what I've just done is I've taken some tape and I've marked the top and the back, mainly because whenever I go to make the joinery on the rabbet, as well as the groove that runs down the length, the pocket screws are going to be face down on the table saw, and I won't be able to know where the top is at. All right, so everything that's going to require joinery, I placed over here by the table saw. This is the center divider, which is going to have 2 dados running across the width, which will hold up these uprights, which will be attached to the tops towards the middle. And then these are the 2 ends that we just talked about. So that way I know exactly what I need to cut on my joinery, so I can do all my batch cutting, and then once I change everything up, I'll know that everything's been cut. So everything's going to require 1/4 inch deep by 3/4 inch wide dados, and then I'll change it up to do the 1/2 inch wide rabbets on the back side. So as you guys can probably tell, building something like this can be fun, but with all the intricacies and recording it, there's bound to be some mistakes. For all my patrons out there, you guys are going to get an extra video showing the mistakes that I made and how I overcame them. If you guys are interested in becoming a patron of the show, check out the link right up there. Now, while I have the dado still set up, I'm doing some test cuts for this notch out that will allow me to get to my pocket screw to screw this together. And there we go. So that will allow me to be able to get to that pocket screw to screw the top to the side. This will also help with airflow because the drawers I'm going to put in here are going to be rather snug. So air will be able to escape in a few different places. Before I add the tops on, I gotta throw in a T-track, so which means I need to set up my dado stack for the appropriate width and height of this particular T-track. So let's run the tops through where I need to. Okay, so I decided to go a little bit different route. Instead of cutting this mounting bracket with the dovetail way to match the 2 opposing dovetail pieces that are going to be on the cabinet, I decided to go ahead and cut this particular mounting bracket the exact size of the jig, and then I'll just trim off at the 90-degree angle of the 2 opposing dovetails to make them fit instead of make this fit. Now, in order to make this centered, I'm just going to put the pieces together and measure how wide it is, and it's 8 1/4 inches, maybe a tiny, like a fraction past. So that means I need to cut 1/4 inch off overall, which is an 1/8 inch from either piece. Even though these things are not going to be mounted this way, they are actually going to be mounted this way, and then the piece goes underneath to keep it secure. This is the easiest way to find out if you fill the gap. Okay, now I wanted to bring something to your attention. Whenever I made this in the plan, I made it to where the plywood was exactly 3/4 inch thick. Now, unfortunately, the plywood that I have is not. It's actually about 0.709. With that being said, that caused a discrepancy of the height of the actual jig sitting on my risers. So if you're gonna do this, and you're gonna make it out of plywood, try and get exactly 3/4 inch plywood. Otherwise, you're gonna have to kind of do what I did. I found a piece of wood that is thicker. It's about 15/16, and it actually takes the place of the 1/4 inch risers that are underneath this particular piece and just basically eliminates them. So what I did is I took this piece, took the 1/4 inch spacers out, and used it as my tray or riser, and then the pieces that I'm going to use for the jig mount go on top of that. And then the jig itself will ride on top of that in that dovetail way. And then when these tops are slid up really, really close to it, the surface area of it is actually right where it needs to be. I mean, it's perfectly flush. So I've gone ahead and attached the jig to the other half of the dovetail way, which is the big half, and it fits perfectly. There's a slight little reveal right here on one end, and then there's a pretty big reveal on the other end. I'll explain what this is later. Because the middle section and the upright dividers are inset of the 2 outside pieces, it's going to make it kind of difficult to put the tops on accurately and square without the jig fully in place. So I've gone ahead and cut a 1/2 inch backer out of some scrap 1/2 inch plywood that I had, which will give me a flush area all the way across the cabinet that I can locate the backs pretty accurately on. What I'm gonna have to do, because the jig itself is not in place, nor is the riser block underneath it. It's just here as a placeholder so I can get this thing centered and know where these tops need to be. So I am going to take one of the tops off and put a couple of dabs of some Star Bond thick adhesive glue in about 4 spots all the way around. And I'll spray the top with some activator. And as I put it down, that activator will speed this stuff up to about a 3-second set. So in between those dots, I am going to put some Titebond glue all the way around. And then by the time this sets up, it will hold it in place enough that I can flip the whole unit over after removing the jig, and then run some pocket screws into the top to keep it nice and secure. Now, one upgrade that I did on this unit versus my prior unit is I added a little bit of a wing on either end of the cabinet so I can clamp it down to a workbench or my assembly table or whatever. Not saying that you have to clamp this down, but it does make it nicer. Now, the reason for this overhang that you see on the jig is for the drawer front. It is actually going to be sitting right up underneath the jig, flush with the front, but there is going to be a cutout the same depth as this jig so it can snug right up into it. So I've gone ahead and taken my centering ruler that I have from Woodpeckers and went ahead and made marks. So now I have guidelines to cut away whenever I go to make the notch. With my lines laid out on the drawer front, now's the time to employ my half lap method to make the cutout for this drawer front to go around the jig. So on my crosscut sled, I have the jig itself, and I'm gonna use it as the spacer because this is what I'm cutting around, so using it as my gauge will give me an exact fit. I've got a stop block here on one side of the jig, and I'm making sure that the jig is nice and flat against my fence and that the stop block is up against the jig. I've also got my drawer front pushed right up against the jig, and the line that I had drawn is right at the edge of the blade on this side of the blade. So whenever I go to make my first pass, it will establish this right side perimeter, and then I can pull it back, remove the jig, slide the piece over. But if I make a cut just like this, the cut is still on the waist side is still on this side of the blade, and I need to push it over to the other side of the blade. So using an 1/8 inch spacer, which is the same thickness as my saw blade, I can put it between the stop block and my piece, and then make my final pass, which will establish both perimeter cuts. So with the outer construction of the cabinet done, I've taken a little bit of time and taped off the areas that I don't want painted. The dovetail ways especially are very important because it will affect how it slides in and out. I'll just coat the bare surfaces with some beeswax, and that will help seal the grain off and allow it to slide in and out very, very easily. The drawers. Now it's time to get on with that. So I found some scrap 1/4 inch ply and some 1/2 inch ply that I have underneath here. The drawer dividers are actually going to be made out of 1/8 inch thick plexiglass. So I picked up a 2 foot by 4 foot long sheet that I'm just going to cut all these pieces out. Now, the joinery where these things slide into, or just basically a dado, real thin one, that these slide into, I'm going to have to cut the overlaps. There's going to be a lot of half laps that these things can slide on top of each other and create adjustable compartments. So I'm going to have to cut all of those around the same time that I cut the joinery for the drawers. I'm going to basically have to take careful measurements of each setting of the fence so I can make sure that these line up with those. And hopefully I can keep everything straight as I go. But I'm going to start with the upper drawers and cut 2 strips at about 1 7/8 inches wide, and then I'll start with the 2 strips that will contain the dividers for the lower drawer. One thing that I did is I put reference marks on one end of all the pieces, and that was the mark that got put up against the fence so I can make sure that the cuts all line up whenever I go to assemble. Before I cut the grooves for the bottom, I went ahead and mirror imaged each one of these. Once I had them mirror imaged, then I flipped them over and then marked the bottom. So that will go up against my fence for all these pieces. Okay, so the dry fit of one of the drawers is good, which means the rest of them are going to be good because everything was batch cut. So I'm very impressed with how the joints are coming together. All of the grooves for the dividers are lining up nicely. I even took one of the plastic pieces that I had and put it inside the center groove, and it lined up perfectly. One of the last things that I need to do is the little Easter egg for this particular cabinet, and that is to make the tool tray. And it's going to be the riser that will go underneath the dovetail way slide out for the mounting block of the jig. Now the last thing I need to do is to cut some 1/4 inch wide strips for the end caps of the door. Now you know that I've been using a type of an acrylic latex enamel called Durapoxy, and now I am using Durapoxy's little brother, which is Durapoxy HP. And it's probably the closest thing that you'll find to a waterborne lacquer, but it has the durability of epoxy. So I'm going to be using Acrylaplex enamel undercoat, so the two should mix really, really nice. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the build process video of this cabinet. It certainly is a great use for anybody that does a lot of pocket screw joinery in their shop. Not to mention, all of the accessories that you have for this jig, all kept in one place. So guys, take care. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Check out my Patreon and Amazon page. I'll see you on the next build video next week. Boom!